All right, global recessions. Where's the conclusion? Jill. Melissa, sorry. Huh?
I thought it was the first part, global recessions can never be prevented.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That is the main conclusion. Any clues that that's the main conclusion?
The next one is a premise. After that, it's a concession. I was like, this is like initially I thought it was an intermediate conclusion, and then I couldn't figure out just like the last sentence didn't. It seemed to just be like another premise.
Yeah, I think it is another premise. So I think you have two premises, and then so you have a conclusion and then two premises. And I think you're looking at the content to figure that out, which is the best way to figure it out. But there are some other clues. Does anyone see another clue? Yes, 4. Yeah, 4 is a premise indicator, which suggests that what you just read is a conclusion. So when it says global recessions can never be prevented, pretty strong, and then it says 4, you're like, oh, now we're going to go into the reasoning. Why? Okay, now, that's a pretty strong conclusion, but it does provide pretty strong evidence, right? What's the strong word in this evidence or phrase?
Never.
That's the conclusion. So that word never makes it a very strong conclusion. But what makes the evidence strong? Yeah?
Could be prevented only if it were predictable.
That's right. Only if it's super strong, right?
Yeah.
They could be prevented only if they were predictable. In other words, if they're not predictable, you cannot prevent them. So far, the conclusion does have adequately strong evidence to back it up. It's a conditional statement, though. So it says, hey, if it's not predictable, then it can't be prevented. And the last sentence says, yet economists, using the best techniques at their disposal, consistently fail to accurately predict global recessions. So if they consistently fail to predict them, then that means they haven't been able to predict them. And if they can't predict them, then they can't prevent them. So the conclusion and the argument makes sense. The problem is that this last premise is what?
Temporal.
Huh?
Temporal.
Yes. It's about the past, right? As opposed to what's going to happen in the future, yet the conclusion was never, right? It's all time. So that's the biggest problem with this argument. And so when it says the economist argument is most vulnerable to the criticism that it does what? It fails to think about the future, basically. And, okay. Answer choice A. Oh, by the way, for this flaw question, do you guys remember the two things you can ask yourself as you are reading the answers?
What's happening?
Is this happening? Mm-hmm.
Where is this happening?
And
Is it a problem?
is it a problem, right? Answer choice A is describing what type of flaw? Circular reasoning, almost always wrong. I've only seen 2 logical reasoning questions in the history of LSAT that were circular reasoning and thus correct. Like making this correct. So if it's circular, you can probably just take a gamble and say it's wrong. Of course, if you get that on your test, then you can always email me afterwards and say I'm an idiot. But I think you'll know that it's a circular reasoning flaw, okay? Answer choice B, what's wrong with this? The argument fails to establish that the economist claims to be able to accurately predict global recessions. It's the opposite, right? No, they didn't fail to establish this, they failed to establish the opposite. C, what makes this word or this one wrong? There's a word in there. What kind of flaw is this describing?
See?
Yeah.
It's treating something.
Sufficient necessary flip.
It's a sufficient necessary flip. Do we have that in the original?
No.
No. The if-then statements were perfectly aligned. They said, hey, look, if you want to prevent, then it has to be predictable. These things are not predictable, therefore not preventable. That's totally fine. So sufficient necessary mix-up is not what we have, and that's what answer choice C is trying to describe. Answer choice D fails to address the possibility that the techniques available to the economists for the prediction of global recessions will significantly improve. Yeah, it fails to address the future. That's basically what D is saying. So D is correct. E implicitly bases an inference that something will not occur. Was the inference is that something will not occur? Solely on the information that its occurrence is not predictable? Is it solely on that? No. This is not describing what's happening, so this is that. Okay. What answers were we debating?
See.
See? Oh. Okay.
Yeah.
Really quick, just to clarify that, listen to this. Treats the predictability of an event. What's the predictability of an event? What event are we talking about?
Global recession.
Global recessions. Treats the predictability of global recessions, which is required for the event to be preventable. Is that true? Is it required? In other words, do you have to be able to predict it to prevent it?
Yeah.
Yes, it said they could be prevented only if they were predictable.
Right.
So this is all true so far. Treats the predictability of an event, which is required for the event to be preventable, yes, 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 as a characteristic that assures its prevention. They never said that predictability guarantees that you'll now be able to prevent it. They just said, look, if you want to prevent it, you have to be able to predict it. But just because you can predict it doesn't now mean that you can prevent it. Right? That'd be a false contrapositive. And they didn't ever make that sort of claim. Morgan?
I mean, I picked that one too. And I just still, I guess, can you like write it? Can you
Sure.
write out the actual statement?
Yeah.
I
So-
think that'll help.
They said that global recessions can never be prevented. They can't be prevented. That's the conclusion. Why? Why? Because they could be prevented only if they were predictable. In other words, if you want to prevent it, then you have to be able to predict it. Are you cool with that? Because only if introduces the then clause.
Yeah, I think I wrote it the opposite way.
Yeah, that's what I
if you
guessed.
wrote it the opposite way because you
Yeah.
did only if and you said, oh, there's an if, that's going to be my if clause.
Which is necessary.
Yes, only if is the necessary condition. Oh, now I see the
So,
cleverness behind
I
writing
wrote
this
it
answer
like
choice.
that, like,
Yeah.
if prevent, then predict.
Oh, you did write it like this?
Yeah, but I still picked C, but I think that's because I read the first part and I was like, oh, this is great. And then I just kind of like didn't put too much thought into the second part of it. So that's why I
Oh,
picked
you didn't
it.
think about the argument too much to figure
Yeah,
out what was
but
wrong.
like I wrote it like that because I knew that only if was necessary.
What's the contrapositive of this?
If it does not predict, then it does not prevent.
Right, if you can't predict, then you can't prevent, right? And then they
Right.
said economists have not been able to predict in the past. Right? That's what they said. So they said not predict in the past. Oh, and then that means, oh, if you can't predict, then you can't prevent. Therefore, you can't prevent. But the problem is, just because they can't predict in the past doesn't mean that they can't predict in the future.
And that's
Yeah.
why significantly improved.
That's why D is correct. And C is just not a problem because we're not having a false contrapositive issue here.
Right.
They are correctly affirming the sufficient condition
Yeah.
to get to the necessary condition.
Yeah. Okay.
Morgan, feel good about that? Okay. Any other questions on this one? Okay.
Can you just explain why E is wrong?
Oh, okay. So implicitly, does the argument implicitly base an inference? An inference is what?
Like
It's
a claim? Like
it's
a-
an inference in these cases is always no a conclusion. An inference is a conclusion. So when it says implicitly bases a conclusion that something will not occur, in other words, global recessions can never be prevented, solely on the information that its occurrence is not predictable, it doesn't do it solely on that information. It had two premises. It had this premise and this premise. This was just our contrapositive of the premise. Right? So basically we had, this was premise 1 and this is premise 2. So that word solely in there makes me really nervous because it wasn't based solely on that.
Okay.
Like right there, I'm not even getting into whether answer choice E is a problem. I'm just saying, is this happening? No, this isn't even happening. So who cares whether it's a problem? Because the correct answer has to be something where you say, yes, this argument is doing this, and yes, that's a problem.
Okay.
Cool? All right.